Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I have an amazing tournament recap video for you today that's going to shine some really good light on the current state of the meta, as well as the first ever player interviews from the top cut. So this is something that I want to get started that I really noticed not a lot of people doing, if very many at all. But in my Yu-Gi-Oh days, I used to see people do deck profile videos where after you made the top cut of one of these big giant tournaments, you would showcase your deck, you would talk through the specific card choices and kind of, basically just get a little bit of a post-game interview of how you performed as well as you did. So I've got two of those lined up in this video, as well as a recap. I think you're going to love this video. I think you're going to enjoy this, especially because there's some really good questions that I asked these people that made top cut, and it's going to shed some light on some of their decision and thought process leading up to their top appearance. So without further ado, let's get to the recap. The Ursiiday finals came down to a mirror match between Sudowoodo. Okay, well, not just Sudowoodo, but also Rampardos and a little bit of a fighting engine. Now, if you scan through the top cut, you will notice there's a lot of Dialga and Arceus. That was the big flavor of the weekend, and it really impressed. I mean, leading up to this tournament, there was a lot of people playing Arceus, Dialga in other tournaments, and you kind of expected to see Leafeon as well. And then obviously Dark Zone, and that was a big chunk of the meta from the top cut. Now there's a couple of players that I'm going to highlight because I've got their post game interview, but I also would say that the variety in the top cut was pretty wide. There was a lot of different decks, and also I really enjoy the fact that Ursi was able to put out a little bit of a graphic on Saturday night after the top cut was announced. So let's check out the graph. This is the breakdown for the top cut. 21.7% other, so probably a lot of those decks are one-ofs, maybe two-ofs. Then there's Arceus Dialga taking up 43% of the day 2/top cut meta. And then you've also got Leafeon taking up 16.7%, Dark Zone taking up 10%, and then other Arceus variants taking up 8.3%. When you look at the metagame, the most played deck was Arceus and Dialga, took up about 12% of the meta. Then when you take a look at the other top decks, you saw a lot of Dark Zone, Leafeon Serebii, Exeggutor Serebii, and for the first time in a long time, Exeggutor Serebii had a pretty poor win percentage. When you take a look at the numbers, 43% win percentage, that's very low. Typically, the first week of the meta, the first weekend of the meta especially, you start to see the new deck take anywhere from like a 55% win percent to, maybe even as high as like a 68 win percent. That's typically what you see when a new deck storms onto the meta. Another thing that you will notice as you scroll through the metagame, the pattern of 18 trainer decks has really been probably as popular as it's ever been in these big tournaments. We've had moments where maybe on the ladder, a lot of people are playing Articuno EX, 18 trainer, but for the first time, it's pretty realistic to say that Articuno EX, Palkia EX are definitely viable 18 trainer decks in the tournament world. However, it does have some weaknesses that are very obvious. And then Pachirisu is also kicking around, but it had the lowest win percentage out of the 18 trainer decks. So definitely expect to see more of that. And, in the video with Vulcan and we really talked about how there's not a lot of bad cards in those 18 trainer decks. It's more just like dead draws when it gets to a certain point in the game. So those decks are here to stay, and it really makes sense because, again, like there's enough good trainers and supporters now to really, take advantage of playing, a guaranteed basic EX Pokemon. The other things when I look at this metagame, there's a lot of decks that are hovering around that 50% win rate. And then obviously we'll talk about a couple of these decks specifically, when you take a look at the winning deck list. So let's go ahead and head on over to the information that we have on the top cut. So in the top cut, there were 26 Dialga Arceus decks, and it had a 55% win rate. There were only 2 Rampardos Lucario decks, and they ended up going all the way. If you were to break down the matchups, there's definitely a little bit of rock, paper, scissors going on between fighting, Dialga, Arceus, and then like grass decks. Like typically speaking, I would say that the grass decks have an advantage going into the fighting decks. However, the fighting decks have an advantage going into the Dialga and Arceus decks. And then, you know, the Dialga and Arceus decks kind of have a little bit of an advantage when it comes to Leafeon and Celebi, as well as Exeggutor and Celebi. So it's a little bit of a kind of like a rock, paper, scissors thing. And so, like, if you're looking at making a meta call into the next tournament, definitely factor in trying to beat basically 2 of those decks. And there's a lot of contenders. We'll talk about that as the week goes on. You know, decks that could fit that specific kind of criteria. So let's get to the deck list of the 2 players that I was able to chat with and get a little bit of an interview with. Whizzy is the first player that I'll talk about. They have made Top Cut and Ursiiday, I believe, multiple times now, and with different decks. And this deck in particular was really cool. It really opened my eyes to the power of Crobat. This is the actual picture of the deck, so that way you can get a little bit of a visual with it. But basically, I went ahead and asked each of these players, you know, 4 questions. So I'll kind of highlight those as I go by. But basically, I started off with asking, you know, what deck did you use and why did you bring it? And they responded, you know, typically, well, they used Arceus, Crobat, and Heatran. And usually they don't play meta decks or, you know, the most played decks in the meta. They like to play something different. And they had already seen that, on, you know, on Friday, Arceus and Dialga were very popular. And then Grass was also up there in terms of the most played. So they decided to run something that could handle both. And so this kind of like reiterates the idea of if you see like a meta kind of starting to take shape, you can make a meta call and build a deck that could beat 2 of those decks in the meta, especially if they're 2 of the more popular ones. They like Crobat in general, and Heatran was good into Grass and Dialga. So they basically took both of those and kind of smashed them together. The next question that I went ahead and asked was, looking at the Top Cut, what stood out to you? They said they really looked and they saw that the Rampardos deck stood out, especially, you know, making it to the finals. And it was already a pretty good deck before the mini set hit. But with the release of Sudowoodo, it definitely got another tool. But to see it finishing first and second was a pleasant surprise. But they definitely expected Dialga or Water, you know, 18 trainer decks to have, you know, a good chance to win. One of the next questions that I asked was, if you could change any cards in your deck, what would they be? They said, you know, hey, I think the Arceus package is adjustable depending on the current meta. Carnivore is good, or Carnivine is good versus fighting. Rotom is good versus stall decks, so there is a lot that you can swap. I would add 1 Pokemon Communication for sure, since the deck wants to get Crobat online ASAP. Now, what's something that I'll add here is when we were chatting before they entered this deck, we had a little bit of a discussion about Giant Cape versus Rocky Helmet in this deck, and I said, hey, I really think that Giant Cape is the right play because you're going to be able to, you know, survive Magnezone hits on, you know, a couple of your Pokemon potentially, assuming that they don't, you know, use Darkrai to ping you for that 20 extra damage. And so I thought that that would be relevant. You know, maybe the argument could be made you could cut a Giant Cape for Pokemon Communication, or, you know, maybe something else. So again, that was the one card that, you know, they said that they would definitely like to add. And then the last question that I asked is, I asked, hey, do you think this deck can repeat this same success? 100% it can. If Rampardos will be on top of the meta chart, you will have to play a version without Crobat, though. Maybe with Heatran plus Rotom, or kind of Carnivine plus Rotom. But it has a lot of tools to tackle many decks. Arceus is a strong boss that it can handle a lot of threats in the current format. So that's my first player interview with Whizzy, who made top 64. And again, you can kind of take back and take a look at their matches. They went up against a lot of the different meta decks. You know, you see Charizard, Arceus, Dialga, Leafeon, Celebi, Dark Zone, more Arceus, Dialga. So, you know, they did get a wide range of decks that they got to play against, and they were undefeated going up against Arceus, Dialga until that top 64 match. Now, the next player I want to highlight is Portland Polyswags. They asked for me to refer to them as Lebrinsin, so that's what I'll be referring to them as. but you can take a look at this deck list here in a moment. You can see that they made it all the way to the top 4, playing Arceus and Dialga. You can even see some of the decks that they got paired up against. It seems like their only losses during Swiss were against the mirror match in some form or fashion, and then they lost in top 4 to the Rampardos Lucario deck. And, so let's talk about this deck list and get to the interview. So I asked the same questions. And by the way, if you want to see different questions or have ideas for different questions, let me know in the comments, because I want this to be something that you guys, the audience, enjoys getting a chance, because nobody else is really doing this, and this is a great opportunity for you to have a voice with some of the top players in the Pokemon Pocket community. So let's talk about this. I asked, hey, what deck did you use? Why'd you bring it? They used Arceus Dialga because their friend did some research before the event and said that this would be the best deck. So they wanted to play the same deck. Their friend ended up going 6-4. So, decent performance, obviously not the same top cut performance. And interestingly enough, they didn't even play this deck before the tournament. They just had a lot of trust in their friend. Looking at the top cut, what stood out to you? They said what stood out was the 18 trainer Palkia and Articuno, which I thought they had gotten lucky, or if they had gotten lucky, they could have easily won the tournament. Of course, Rampardos stood out, but I was just hoping to avoid it all tournament, which I did besides top 4. Also, I think double Shaman is never the wave in terms of like the retreat Shaman. They said that the Healing Shaman is way better because Healing Shaman really helps you in tough matchups like with Exeggutor or with Darkrai and Magnezone. So there's a little bit of alpha for you. And all along, that's kind of one of the big things that I've also agreed with. I tried playing around with the Retreat Shaman, and like it's decent, but again, being able to heal damage is such a big deal, especially in a deck like this that can kind of nullify that Darkrai ping, that Greninja ping, any kind of like potentially chip damage that goes on throughout the span of a game. The next question that I asked was, if you could change any of the cards in your deck, what would they be? I really don't know that I would change anything, but if you really, made me change anything, potentially add a second leaf over the Adaman. But they did mention that Adaman was able to win them some games versus Exeggutor, which is really fascinating. And also they said, I wouldn't have made top cut if I didn't have Adaman. They really like the list. So I wanted to expand on this a little bit. If you use Adaman at certain times, it almost acts like a second giant, or like another giant cape. I don't want to say second, but another giant cape, because your opponent may have, done the math for a 2-hit KO, and now you play Adaman, and now that 2-hit KO is no longer possible. So that's the way that I would look at Adaman, and it's really fascinating for the rest of the meta for us to kind of have this deck or have this card in our toolbox for these steel type decks, especially decks that are focusing on playing cards like Dialga, and hey, maybe even my twin Probopass. I don't know. Maybe that's some magic technology. The next question that I asked was, do you think this deck can repeat the same success? And they said, I think this deck can repeat the same success if you don't play the fighting decks most of the tournament. Besides the fighting decks and the God Misty high rolls, it's clearly the best deck in the format. So there you have it from somebody who made top 4. Again, shout out to Lebrinsin, shout out to Whizzy. Thank you guys for adding those, player interviews to my video content. And again, I hope that you guys in the audience that are watching this enjoy that extra little bit of tidbit of info. And hey, again, if you want to see more content like this, hit that button on the bottom right of the video. That's going to subscribe you to my channel, so that way you can get notified whenever new videos come out. And again, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to check out my videos. Maybe you learned something, maybe you were entertained, but again, I can't thank you enough. And if you would leave a comment, that would definitely help the video get into more people's algorithms. But until next time, I will catch you later. Peace.